Greetings. Fred Kemp, the Atlantic Council CEO and President, who knows the importance of this meeting, told me we should help our audience to answer the following question: why should we care about Sudan? I would like to focus my welcoming remarks on that question, why Sudan matters. First, by size, Sudan is the largest country on the African continent, 5 times the size of Germany. It borders 7 countries. It straddles the Nile, which gives the fate of this nation an existential importance for 2 mighty countries, Egypt and Ethiopia. Sudan has also one of the greatest potential for agricultural development. Only 15% of its potential there is used, which is extraordinarily attractive to countries in the neighboring Middle East. In addition, Sudan has a rich soil. It is Africa's 3rd largest producer of gold. But if this country matters on the African continent, it's because of a multi-millennial civilization. Sudan has not always been synonymous with civil wars. The Nubian kingdom, then those of Napata and Merowe, were filled by the Egyptian pharaohs. Women played an exceptional role, like the Candaces of Merowe, strong leaders and fierce warriors, who chose their husbands and went to marry them. In 700 years, they built more pyramids than the pharaohs in 3,000 years of civilizations. In moments of despair, we must remember the exceptional legacy that Sudan has left to humanity. Here are the reasons why, as director of the Atlantic Council Africa Center, I wanted to organize this event and ask Ambassador Mary Yates, Atlantic Council board member and former chargé d'affaires at the US Embassy in Khartoum, to moderate it, given her strong experience in the country. For nearly 10 years, the Africa Center has focused its work on Sudan with the goal of acknowledging Sudan's geostrategic importance. And Mary Yates has always been a key part of that work. She will be joined by our distinguished speakers here. I would like to warmly thank for their help to understand the events in Sudan. Over to you, Ambassador, for the introduction of our guest and also the moderation of this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Rama. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for that great introduction, Rama. Before I begin, I'd like to say something personal from the heart about Sudan. You mentioned I was chargé there. Before that, I worked on the Sudan Working Group at the White House for about 2 years before President Obama asked me to go and serve as a temporary chargé. But no matter how many years of meetings you had, you really couldn't understand Sudan until you got on the ground. I wasn't prepared for the Sudanese people, these amazing people, the rich culture that you've just described, the very talented youth, and the very strong female leaders in the country. So I immediately realized that it's Sudanese people who are their treasure and their wealth. They are ready for something new. They are ready for freedom and democracy and access to enterprise. But before I left there, I wrote a rather poignant cable. It was the end of my foreign service career, so I was a little bit free to speak my mind. And I said, I didn't think we had our relationship analyzed and our policy decisions exactly right. So then I was thrilled when I came back that the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, under the direction of Peter Pham, decided to form a Sudan task force, and we could begin to look at how we would re-engage. And so but in all of our writing and work from 2015 to 2018, none of us envisioned what was going to happen in the streets of Khartoum and throughout the country in 2019 when the protesters overthrew the dictator Bashir. But now, where are we after this hopeful 2019? We are at a major crisis, and therefore the Atlantic Council has assembled this group of experts whom I have the honor to introduce to you. Before I do that, may I remind viewers that if you want to posit questions, please put them in the chat and the chat thing on the bottom of your screen, and the Atlantic Council staff will feed them to me for towards the end of our conversation. So to our stellar panel, Ambassador Tim Carney, he was the former U.S. ambassador. He was a retired Foreign Service officer after having 32 years in the Foreign Service. Yes, he was the last accredited ambassador there from 95 to 97. But of course, since then, Ambassador John Godfrey arrived, which is wonderful for all of us. Unfortunately, he's been evacuated. Tim also served as ambassador in Haiti and on several UN missions, and after retirement in our missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Next, E.J. Dorn, excuse me, EJ. He's a former senior advisor to the UN U.S. Special Envoy, who was envoy to Sudan and South Sudan between 2019 and 2023. This supported Sudan's transition towards democracy and the implementation of Sudan and South Sudan peace agreements. Before that, he was the deputy program director for Africa at the International Crisis Center. And last but not least of these first group, Ambassador Nuruldin Sati, who was their first returning ambassador. He arrived in July of 2020, but he is a global fellow and co-chair of the Wilson Center Sudan Working Group, a retired UN official, and I've known for a long time his work and experience in mediation and conflict resolution and peacekeeping and peace building. So welcome, Nuruldin. We are also honored to have Nicole Wiedersheim. She is currently the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch in Washington, but she also served as a Senior Policy Advisor at the Prevention for Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And prior to that, she was at the NSC in the African Affairs section in charge of the Sudans and the Central African Republic. And last but not least, a fellow from the Atlantic Council, Tom Warwick. He is with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security Forward Defense. And before he joined the Atlantic Council, Tom was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. And in 2016, Tom led an interagency group to Khartoum to talk with the Sudanese about counterterrorism cooperation at that point in hope of lifting the state sponsor of terrorism sanctions. He's also an international lawyer from the Middle East. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to do a round of questions, and I hope we're going to have brief answers, but we want them also informative. EJ, can I throw the big ball to you in a few minutes? How did we get here with the military fighting the paramilitary? And is there any credibility to the U.S. media stories that are coming out that it was a problematic framework agreement? So we deserve some responsibility for this. Over to you, EJ, to set the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Yates. So very quickly and in a very kind of simplistic way, let me explain how we got here. So long-serving dictator Omar al-Bashir came to power in 1989 in a coup. And not surprisingly, Omar al-Bashir was worried that a coup would be launched against him. So what he very consciously did is he fragmented the security services in an effort to kind of try to play them off against each other and to essentially coup-proof his government and his regime. One security service within that larger framework of security services was the so-called Rapid Support Forces, which is commanded by a general who's best known by his nickname, Hemeti. And the RSF basically was a paramilitary force that had been created during the 2000s and continued on through 2010s as a counterinsurgency force focusing on the then rebellion in Darfur. And that force was responsible for many, many abuses in that region of the country. Fast forward, in 2018, for a number of reasons, popular protests calling for democracy, calling for Omar al-Bashir, to leave power, broke out. They gathered steam, and by 2019, the pressure became very, very significant. And the security services basically started to coordinate. And in April, the RSF and the titular security forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, coordinated and unseated al-Bashir and created their own transitional military council. Unfortunately, from the perspective of the military, this did not stop the protests. Protests continued. The military actually carried out some massacres and other atrocities that increased pressure on them. And essentially, the military was forced to make concessions in August of 2019 to form a civilian military partnership with the protesters. That partnership was a compromise, an effort to try to get at the civilians in, at least in a substantial way. But negotiators essentially allowed the military to retain a political role, particularly in something called the Sovereignty Council, because of fears that if they weren't included, they would continue to revolt or they would continue to use repression against the civilians. You can question whether that was the right choice or not. Lots of people will have opinions about that. So for about 2 years, things went relatively well. The government under then Prime Minister Hamdok made some strides, albeit slowly, implemented some very significant economic reforms. But, and here's the big but, as part of the agreement that established this government, there was a provision to hand over power from the Sovereignty Council, or I'm sorry, have the military hand over power in the Sovereignty Council from them to civilians, which made the military quite nervous. And essentially they decided to launch yet another coup in October of 2021. And essentially the last year and a half, international partners have been trying to pressure the military to cede power back to the civilians. One of the biggest aspects of these negotiations was so-called security sector reform. And the key element of that security sector reform was, how are we going to unify all the security services into one national security structure and then hopefully take care of this problem? Because essentially, partners have been struggling with this rivalry between the RSF and the SAF for the last 4 years, and worried about, what would happen if anyone were to see one side taking advantage over the or gaining advantage over the other. And essentially, what we believe happened is that General Hemeti, the commander of the RSF, felt that his power was potentially going to wane over the next period, and thus he decided to launch a coup against General Burhan, the leader of the SAF, and that led to the fighting that we are now trying to stop.
So EJ, then you're putting more blame on Hemeti and the military or the paramilitary, and you don't buy into the idea that the framework agreement was problematic. Is that accurate? Am I reading you correctly?
Well, you've given me 2 or 3 minutes. I think.
And then I ask you another question.
Yes. Blame can be cast all around. I think that there were lots of concerns about the framework agreement, some of them legitimate, some of them, I think, somewhat unrealistic. Look, all these negotiations, as the ambassadors on this call know, are messy. Certainly, I would say self-critically, we could have included more civilian voices in these negotiations. Other things could have been done to kind of make the talks more inclusive. But fundamentally, one of the things that international diplomats struggled with was you had 2 very large armies. They were relatively equally balanced in terms of power. And we were all quite worried about the possibility of conflict breaking out between these groups. And rightly or wrongly, that was one of the factors that was always on the front of our minds when we were negotiating with the actors in Sudan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you mentioned the ambassadors. I'm going to turn to them in order. Tim, you know what it's like to shutter an embassy. You did it in 96. How hard a decision is that to close an embassy? And then how do we get U.S. diplomatic presence restarted, which will be critical in going forward? Tim, over to you. Ambassador Carney.
Thanks, Mary. Yes, it's incredibly difficult to get an embassy to close. I argued strongly against it back in 1996. The evacuation was with an embassy staff of no more than 15 or 20 people. We went out first class by Lufthansa from the international airport in Khartoum. The situation of today, with the evacuation of almost all the diplomats, as nearly as I can determine, from Khartoum, is far different, where you have actual fighting in the city itself, with everyone being frozen in place because it was deemed too dangerous to move. The problem that resulted in was it dismayed, first of all, the nationals of the various countries that the diplomats fled back to, who stayed in Sudan with seemingly little hope of getting out. And second, it dismayed Sudanese, who saw possible elements of pressure on these two generals vanishing from their very soil. What resulted afterwards is what we see now, in that we have enormous numbers of Sudanese fleeing to Chad, to Egypt, to Ethiopia, as I understand it, to South Sudan as well. Port Sudan has become a fairly safe venue for people to flee to, and then flee from, to get out of Sudan. The U.S. has put two naval ships, the destroyer Truxtun and a large sort of people mover, the Puller, offshore at Port Sudan, where presumably people will be able to join it. The big problem with all this is, how do you stay in contact with the two generals so that you can try to bring them to see reason? And yes, communication now is a lot better than it was in 1996. For example, the Secretary of State has been in regular contact with both Hemeti and Burhan at this point, but it's a very complicated, difficult way to do communication if you don't have diplomatic staff on the ground. And my last point is that while the UN's special representative of the Secretary General, Volker Perthes, is apparently back briefly in New York, he is said to be heading back to Khartoum, and he will be a valuable and important contact point with the two generals when he gets there.
That's good. I wasn't realized he was headed back there. I think that's terrific. Most of the UN has been evacuated. Ambassador Sati, you are our Sudanese voice, and I've listened to you for many years. I would really like to open it to you to help us understand the Sudanese perspective in all of this. Is there any popular support for one side over the other in this conflict? And I've heard you speak eloquently about the complexity of the makeup of each military side, the military and the paramilitary. Ambassador Sati, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Mary. Thank you to Atlantic Council. Popular support per se, I do not see very clearly any kind of support to either of the two sides from a popular point of view. The popular point of view is against the war and for stopping the war. There could be one group or the other who may be supporting this side or the other for various reasons, but the main message is that, to my mind, the majority of the Sudanese people would not like the continuation of this war because they know that they are suffering, they are living the war, and they wanted to stop as quickly as possible. From another perspective, since this had been brought into the discussion, To my mind, is since the beginning, there was a clear, I think, what shall I call it, dichotomy, I would say, between the logic of a revolution, what I call the euphoria and the wishful thinking of a revolution, and the reality of governance in the country like Sudan. And I say I have warned against this since December 2019 when we had our discussions within the FFC and other groups, that the balance of power is not in favor of the revolutionaries or the civilians, and that the military detained the guns and detained the wealth, while on our side we had the street, the power of the street. For how long is going the power of the street? Which one is going to outlast the other? And I said very clearly that civilian military relations have to be examined. And I sent to that effect, actually, a memo to both Hamdouk and to Burhan on this. I delivered it in person to Hamdouk. And I sent it to Burhan because I had not met him at that time through somebody who knew him better than me. And the idea is that we need a dialogue, a very clear and frank dialogue between civilians and military on the future of the relations and how do the military accommodated within the democracy, the Sudanese brand of democracy, a country that has suffered for decades of military predominance. To getting them out of this formula is not going to be easy. And we need all the acumen and all the political, will and determination and knowledge of the civilians themselves and the reality of power in Sudan. Unfortunately, I do not think that this has been done in a convenient way. The other thing, the military naturally, of course, as we all know, feared, handing over power to the civilians for the reason that we all know. Issues of accountability and financial resources, but the street was pushing very hard for accountability yesterday. And we all know, having worked in various situations, similar situations, that is not possible. You cannot just take guns out of the power of the military. It has not been done in any other countries without a political process in which they are involved in a very real dialogue, where some kind of assurances are given to them and some kind of assurances they give to the population about how they are going to behave in a democratic circumstances. Unfortunately, this has been done. The street is still mobilized, even if it's really affected by what's going on, and it's going to be affected. But to my mind, we need to rebuild. For me, this is becoming more of a social, a dilemma more than anything else. We need to re-knit, the social fabric, because there is a fear that this is going to be completely dismantled because of this war, and rebuild, the grassroots movements in the areas that are not directly affected by the war now, whether it's the areas of the Eastern Sudan, Post-Sudan region, some parts of Kordofan and Darfur and the Jazeera and those areas, and some parts of Blue Nile and Kordofan. And how are we going to re-knit this social value, fabric, and create a basis for a social movement that would gradually move towards the capital and convince those who are fighting to stop the war. Of course, this cannot be done without support from the outside. And later on, I can come to this aspect of humanitarian assistance and political process and how they can be combined together.
Thank you, Nuruldin, for your insights and your wisdom. I have 100 questions I could ask you right now, but I do want to come back in another round to talk about scenarios going forward, and this is all very useful for that. If I can turn next to Nicole, from your perch at Human Rights Watch and your vast experience, what is the view right now of some in the American advocacy community? How is the Biden-Harris administration being seen in all of this? And what should we be concerned about with the human rights abuses? We had the news last night too about the lab that is coming under control of the RSF, so over to you, Nicole, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ambassador. And also thanks to Atlantic Council for getting the human rights perspective and inviting us here today. It is deeply personal for me. I started working in South Sudan in 1998, spent 7 years in the country. And the organization that I represent has been documenting crimes and abuses by both of these leaders and the militaries that they, and armed and paramilitaries that they control for decades. We have all our reports available on our website. They go all the way back to Darfur, and even to the Sudanese military's operations in South Sudan at the region of South Sudan at the time. So, but that goes to one of the main points that we're pressing right now is that, you know, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, we keep empowering bad actors who have a long list of atrocity crimes and war crimes and abuses on their record, and we don't give them any that there's nothing to block them from continuing to use the same tactics, they will continue to use the same tactics. I mean, this is where we are right now today. I think no place represents better the things that are happening in Sudan with a culture of total impunity and lack of accountability. We are, we are working closely with the advocacy community. You know, all of us here have years of experience in Sudan in general, and South Sudan. And so in some ways, one would hope that we're all positioned to be focused, galvanize opinion on what needs to be done. And right now, what we're trying to center a call for is a full arms embargo. We're not naive that machinery and weapons would just stop flowing if the UN did pass a full arms embargo. But we're trying to make sure that people don't think narrowly on the parties to the conflict and also think about their enablers in the region that is, you know, quite possibly, Ambassador Yates, you mentioned scenarios and what we're going to discuss later, but possibly ripping this country apart, which none of us want to see. We're also, the advocacy community is quite interested in seeing deterrence on the actors. We see lots of evidence. We're collecting it, we're researching it to be clear and verified that there is indiscriminate attacks. And they're not, both parties to the conflict are not making the basic actions and to mitigate harm against civilians. Over 4,000 people have been injured and they can't even access basic care for their injuries right now, let alone an estimated 500 civilians killed. So we're looking at that. So watch our work on that to document indiscriminate attacks on civilians and the nature of the warfare that's underway. And the other thing I would say is that we're very concerned about the vulnerabilities that were already existing in the country, particularly in Darfur, Southern Kordofan. These areas had people who needed humanitarian assistance who weren't accessing it. They were experiencing violence already from affiliated militias with the RSF and other actors involved right now in the violence in Khartoum and outside of in other areas. So there's a lot to dig into. There's a lot to watch. But, you know, with regards to where we can go, we would really like to see, as Ambassador Sati said, a refocusing both from the US government, but also the international community writ large, and including the regional leaders in the African Union, a refocusing of the civilians and the citizen movement in the political process going forward. I think the tone since the revolution was that, you know, those of us that were calling for that, and even the resistance committees and the people themselves on the street, was that, well, you're a little naive. We have these hugely armed actors, and we must deal with the men, primarily the men with the guns first, before we can really talk about true democracy. And I think that, you know what that has led us to? The situation and the catastrophe we're seeing unfolding right now, because those groups have been empowered. So we really think that the international community needs to be creative, look at other examples. They're not perfect, but I heard many US government actors say, well, you know, how do we work with the resistance committees? They're, you know, this huge fluid movement. They're not, you know, one big entity. And it's like, well, you know, that's how this came to be in Afghanistan. When years and years ago, we looked at a Loya Jirga format, like try to recenter your state focused and your armed actor focused approach back to true democracy and civilian freedom platform, and think of a way in which you're going to engage with the civilian leaders of this country going forward and putting them in the center of your foreign policy.
Nicole, thank you so much. You underscored so many important points, and bringing the civilians back in and having them, just as Neraldine said, having them a key part of the dialogue going forward. And we're going to get back to that in a moment. But Tom, you sit with a unique position and background with your work in counterterrorism. And I think possibly, certainly the people on this call may be aware, but maybe not the wider audience, why the relationship with Sudan and counterterrorism over the years and decades has been important. And we have to think strategically for our country and the Western world as well. Can I throw it over to you to sort of talk to us about the transit nature of Sudan and counterterrorism?
Yes, so counterterrorism is one of the most important security issues that the United States and Europe need to pay attention to, and why they should be interested in Sudan, even after you start with the humanitarian and the human aspect of the conflict that's going on there. Sudan was at one point a state sponsor of terrorism, but the irony is that the Sudanese leadership abandoned that more than 10 years ago. And so in 2016, when I led an interagency delegation to Khartoum, we found with the elites, political and military and security, that there was a willingness to turn the page and become an active partner. Sudanese parents, it turns out, don't want their children to be recruited into ISIS any more than parents everywhere else in the world want for their children. The problem is that Sudan has large borders. It had airports that connected with capitals like Damascus. And there was a time when it was a major transit country for ISIS and Al-Qaeda operatives trying to move from Libya into Iraq and Syria and into the wider world. The concern is still there. And the problem stems from the fact that ungoverned spaces are where terrorist groups flourish. It's where they're able to move freely. They can move people and money, operatives, weapons, materiel. And it's hugely important that there be responsible governments in Khartoum and a willing partner that the United States and the West can work with. So this really ought to spur Western and international efforts to try to bring pressure, not just on the generals themselves, but on the patrons of the generals, because Sudan does need to be part of a security architecture that looks after the protection of its civilian population, but also that helps prevent Sudan from being used by terrorist groups as it was in the past, when they tried to smuggle operatives and money and weapons in and out of the country to carry out terrorist attacks on the West.
Okay. Thank you. Excellent. And I hope we can get back and talk about your Middle East experience and what our friends in the Gulf are doing, good and bad in all of this. EJ, if I can turn back to you, and I say to the other panelists, if you want to jump in on this, I want you to ask you to look at the likely scenarios for a resolution or a further deterioration of this situation. And also, I mean, when we think about it, and I think a question came in about what if the Russians and the Chinese stay and the rest of the Western diplomats have left? Where does that leave us of who's negotiating? And what should the US and the Quad, turning back to the Middle East, be looking at to do next? That's a lot out there, but I'd like to hear your scenarios, because that's the brilliance you brought to the Sudan envoy's office so often.
Well, again, I'll try to do it very briefly. So I think plausibly there are probably three scenarios. One, the most hopeful, is that the international community, particularly the countries that are most invested in Sudan's stability, coordinate their efforts and put pressure on all the parties, as they're doing right now, to stop the fighting, to return to the negotiating table, and I should say, continue on these framework agreement negotiations tracks, which is to restore a civilian-led government in Sudan, which is what most of the Sudanese people want. Unfortunately, I don't think that that's quite likely as of yet. I think that this conflict between General Burhan and General Hemeti is existential, and that we will probably see a breakdown in the ceasefire. I hope I'm wrong. There are two other bad scenarios. The first bad scenario is kind of what I would call the Lebanon scenario, which is when you have state actors basically piling into the conflict and supporting the different sides. And you have two well-supplied armies fighting each other in urban areas and, you know, exacerbating the humanitarian catastrophe that's already occurring. You know, as people may know, the Lebanese war lasted for a long, long time. The war in Sudan could last for a long, long time. And if the war continues, it will also destabilize the rest of the region. There's another variation where you have the war continuing. Potentially you have the SAF, which has the Sudanese armed forces, that is, which has, you know, which has fighter jets, bombers, tanks, etc., expelling the RSF from the capital, but not really being in a position to completely defeat the RSF. The RSF essentially retreats to its heartland, which would be Darfur. The RSF would then potentially want to maintain control over that region, and you would essentially see a Darfur conflict 2.0 on steroids. You would see all the attendant atrocities that we saw in the 2000s, ethnic cleansing, all the other kind of things. And you potentially see even other ethnic groups trying to create facts on the ground. And essentially you would see the collapse of most of the central state and kind of a Somalia / scenario or Syria scenario in Sudan, which of course would also be a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. And again, it would destabilize not just Sudan, but the region. So in my view, what needs to happen is the fighting needs to be stopped as soon as is possible. I agree that pressure needs to be put on all the different parties. I would argue it is not necessarily weapons that we should be focusing on. I think we should be focusing on money. The parties need money to continue their conflict. In particular, General Hemeti, who has a very, very large business empire in Sudan, and has been able to use all that money to sustain this paramilitary force and to grow it. And I think, you know, we have partners, the US that is, has partners who know that if they freeze bank accounts, external bank accounts, that's where all the money is held because of the sanctions you refer to. And that could very, very quickly change the calculations of the different leaders and I believe would force them back to the negotiating table, would change the balance of power between the two fighting armies, and would hopefully lead us to a place where they would actually need to negotiate in good faith. And then, of course, again, continue on these negotiations in which they have all promised to pass power back to the civilians. Over.
Thank you, EJ. That's not terribly uplifting, but certainly I think a realistic analysis. One thing you mentioned is we've got to stop the fighting in any way that we can, any of the players. And that makes me turn to, we haven't spent much time talking about the dire humanitarian situation on the ground and how it could possibly get worse. I know, Nuruldin, that you have been, Ambassador Sati, you have been working on this and meeting with some Sudanese groups. And I know, Tim, you've also focused on what has to be done for those 16,000 American citizens remaining in the country. So, Nuruldin, if I can turn to you to give us an update of what you understand, either about the conditions of the humanitarian situation or what is being done and proposed. And then, Nicole, if you would chime in as well.
Yeah, the humanitarian situation is catastrophic, particularly, of course, in the areas where there is ongoing fighting. Hospitals are being targeted. Most of the hospitals in Khartoum and surrounding areas and many of the other cities are not functioning anymore. And some of them are occupied by the fighting forces, particularly the RSF, taking them as bases for their activities. bombing and shelling and rockets and aviation and all that used in urban areas in an incredible manner, which is really causing a lot of mayhem. People are unable to go out of their houses, to cater for their livelihoods, so to get, supplies, and not, many of the bodies are, scattered around the streets, and nobody is collecting them. Services, have stopped completely, and there is nothing that can be done as long as this war continues. And if it does, Khartoum is going to be a ghost city, a completely ghost city, and many other cities will follow also, because this war is going to spread, as EJ has just mentioned. So what can be done? We need to consider very seriously. I'm discussing with some of our partners what can be done on this. What kind of humanitarian corridors can be created, whether Port Sudan can be used as a launching pad for humanitarian assistance, how this humanitarian assistance is going to be delivered, who is going to be on the side of the international community, including the US, is going to be working on this. What kind of supplies will be food, and one of the things is happening is that, some strategic stockpiles of wheat and flour has been looted in Khartoum North and other places. So how can you replace those ones, and how can you take them to the needy in the areas where there is still fighting, or areas relatively safe where you can create conditions for reception or distribution, channels or points for this. How can you protect the providers? What kind of coordination can exist with the African Union and IGAD, because we need what I call the political umbrella of the region. We do not want to be seen as a Western initiative, as has been done in many countries, and even concerning the issue of humanitarian assistance and other actions that are being taken, including counterterrorism. We should not be seen as a Western problem or a Western initiative alone. We need to create for it the required, I would say, political umbrella, where the region will be associated and will be adopted and owned by the African Union, IGAD, the neighbors of Sudan, the Arab League, and other partners of Sudan should be concerned. So the message will come that this is not only the West who is there to help you. We are there also. We are working for the West, and the West is supporting us to support you. I think this is very important, to create the right kind of environment and avoid resistance that we have seen in many circumstances, including in Sudan, where people about foreign intervention, foreign interference, and accusing each other of being sold out by one or this other country. So this needs, we are discussing with some of our partners very carefully what planning can be done. And even after this meeting, I have a meeting with some of them and see. And this, of course, has to be done in contact with the agreement with the fighters, so that they can create the conducive environment for that. Prolonging the ceasefire for a further period instead of 3 days, making it 1 week and then 2 weeks and then 1 month, and creating the conditions for this and opening the stage for the political process that EG have been talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nuruddin. I'm hoping that this committee, this forming of like-minded people, the Sudanese diaspora and the Sudanese and the Western powers, you need a GoFundMe page, so there's money to do something for this. So, Tim, over to you.
Right, on the matter of humanitarian access, USAID has announced that a DART team is in Nairobi looking at humanitarian matters. The team is too far from the problem in Sudan. I would submit that they should go either to Juba or possibly to Port Sudan, where there seems to be adequate security. I'm sure the DART team is looking at contingencies of chartering aircraft and organizing with WFP food supplies. If necessary, you could airdrop supplies to more remote areas of Sudan that are cut off from their normal commercial access to food at this point. But either. I think Nicole might have something to add in this discussion.
Nicole.
Sure. Yes, we were pleased to see the DART stood up, as Ambassador Carney said. And I also think that there's lots of innovation and creativity that has been done in the full, robust response to the Ukraine crisis. That Sudan and the scale of the catastrophe certainly merits looking at those lessons learned in the last year or so in Ukraine and what was able to be possible. So in that space, there's the ability of the international community to walk and chew gum at the same time. They're able to fund and stand up mechanisms to document human rights abuses, look immediately at justice processes and what's appropriate and what the Sudanese people might be asking for, because none of these explosions of violence over the last 20, 25 years have ever seen any true justice process. While dealing with a cessation of hostilities, hopefully getting humanitarian assistance pre-positioned in the region, and also looking and using, it's different, right? So we know from OCHA that already 15 million people were in need of assistance in the country prior to this catastrophe. I mean, that's huge. And there were huge needs in Southern Kordofan and in Darfur. Then you have the example of the resistance committees and the civilians organizing themselves and providing water and basic healthcare and assistance in the Khartoum and in the Khartoum suburbs. You know, the humanitarian community and the international actors should look to fortify that organization. It's been stellar and impressive. You know, we often look at that and think, gosh, I think they're ready to govern, right? Because they're able to do this repeatedly over and over when the state breaks down or is attacked by these actors. And so there's lots of different things that can happen to improve the humanitarian situation. We just need the international community focused, centered, and aggressive. Totally agree with EJ that, you know, absolutely. And I should have opened with that the cessation of hostilities is paramount. And cutting off resources, whether they be weapons or money. But we also know, and Ambassador Carney, you mentioned this about, I think it was you that mentioned money. I mean, right now, people can't even access bank accounts. With the damage on the cell towers and the telecom communications, you know, all of these things, these all need to start to be collected and look at how to get the basics established again. You know, people very early days, about 4 days into the crisis, people were talking about how the militias were raiding electronic stores, stealing all the battery chargers. You know, these type of things need to be addressed immediately. There's humanitarian assistance, and then there's non-humanitarian emergency assistance, like that battery chargers and SIM cards and, you know, emergency. I've seen this done in Haiti and other places where you stand up intermittent kind of temporary cell towers to deal with the amount of infrastructure damage that's been that has happened in such a short time of 12 days. So I hope that all these things are getting looked at simultaneously. We have the ability to do it as the international community, and we rise to the challenge when geopolitics focuses us on other regions outside of Africa. So I hope that we can get the same amount of attention and ingenuity in rapid time.
Thank you, Nicole, for that sort of granularity. I mean, I just learned a lot of things about what is happening on the ground. And, you know, you make me think we ought to have a program just focused on humanitarian and just focused on a ceasefire. And, you know, there are many things we can do. Tom, if I can turn to you, stepping back out a little bit, because people mentioned that we've got to have other groups pressuring the two sides as well. And I think it would be interesting to know a little bit more about the regional players from the Middle East, especially, and quite specifically the neighbor Egypt, with its long history from the condominium on down. You know, what role is President Sisi going to play? And you don't have to talk about him specifically, but I'm concerned about where we feel the regional players are having a positive or negative effect, or how could it become more positive? Over to you, Tom.
Well, so I'm going to answer Carol Van Dam's question that she posed to us. The generals, as has previously been said, seem to be fighting what they believe to be a struggle for their political and perhaps even physical survival, each one afraid that if they lose, there is no second place in this contest. And indeed, Western diplomacy in Khartoum tried to establish that and appears to have failed. I would argue that attention now needs to focus on the sponsors of these two factions, the people who are providing both sides with weapons, with money, with support through business ventures and other kinds of means. Egypt right now has been supporting General Burhan. It should be especially concerning in Washington, Brussels, and London that the RDF is getting support from the Russian-backed Wagner Group, which has a history not only of atrocities in Syria and in Ukraine and in Africa, but has been fundamentally destabilizing throughout the Sahel, going as far west as Mali. And this is one of the things that I hope really will make Washington and Brussels and London sit up and pay attention. Because at this point, the generals are not going to listen to the diplomats who are no longer in Khartoum, but they have to listen to the sponsors and the other providers of their lifelines. And if those actors choose to bring pressure on the parties to settle, that might actually work. The only other scenario, which is hard to contemplate, would be a massive kind of Egyptian or some other military intervention. Because one thing to be clear, as much suffering as there is going on in Khartoum and other cities right now, these forces are very thin militarily. It was obvious that the United States and Britain and other countries were able, with a small number of special operations forces, to make sure that the warring sides got the message that they should not interfere with convoys trying to evacuate people out of Khartoum. So a military intervention could completely overturn the table, but I don't think that's the most likely scenario. I think it's important for there to be pressure to be brought so that the countries, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have influence in the situation but don't control it, to begin to exert that influence in a positive direction. And the hope is that we would be able to see international pressure from capitals to these other countries to push the parties to end the fighting and to reach an accommodation that does not make this a battle for physical survival.
And can I just clarify that if there were a military intervention by another country, the likely intervention would come from Egypt? Is that correct?
That would be the most likely one if there was to be such an attempt. But let's be clear, because neither side has been able to establish its ascendancy in the fighting on the ground in Khartoum. That what this amounts to is dropping a brick on a balance scale, and it would, clearly destabilize the politics in the region. And certainly, all of us who've had experience, as Ambassador Carney has, Ambassador Sati, and you, Ambassador Yates, that the absolute worst thing you can do is stage one of these major military operations, upset the situation, and then leave, which creates an immense vacuum. And leads to instability. And again, as I said at the outset of my remarks, all of us in the West and in Africa should be concerned about the possibility that Sudan becomes a failed state, even worse than it was 10 to 15 years ago. And so to that end, it really is worth the United States, Europe, and the countries of Africa and the Middle East paying a great deal of attention to what's going on in Sudan, to try to bring this fighting to an end, to try to establish a political process that does not make the generals or others feel as though they either win or they die, and to establish what I hope would be a return to civilian rule, because the question that civilian rule answers really is, how do you make sure that the benefits of Sudanese society accrue to as many people as possible, not just to the supporters of one particular warlord?
The military elite, yes. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of our time, even though it looks like we can stay over just a little bit. And we have had excellent questions coming in from the audience. One I'd like to throw out there to anyone who wants to take it on is an unfortunate happening that has occurred in the last few days is that the prisons have been opened and that some of the war criminals, some of the former Bashir sort of loyalists have been let out. What does that do to the political equation, and who are they going to side with, and what is happening? Can I ask someone to take that on? EJ, Neraldine, Tim, anyone?
No, let me maybe jump in here. Yes, some of the leaders of the former regime escaped, quote unquote, from prison, and they some of them, Mr. Ahmed Haroun, who is a former governor of North Kordofan, and one of the leaders of the former regime, and who is indicted by ICC, made a statement to the effect that we are now out of prison. We are going to work in order to defeat the rebellion, meaning the RSF, of course. Well, in the face of it, this is, could be acclaimed by many people because many people want to have a single Sudanese army and to empower the army and all that. But the reality of it is that the Islamists of the former regime, including himself and others who have fled the prison, have been igniting the flames, and reportedly they are the ones who have been behind, triggering this war in the first place. By going between the two sides and carrying all kinds of messages, and it's reported also that the former the forces of the former regime, particularly the former PDF, Popular Defense Forces, what the Mujahideen, and what Sudan is called militia Tadil, or the also phantom militia, something that are fighting side by side with the army. And some reports are saying actually they are the ones, the main fighters in this. So there is a twist to that. We defeating the rebellion, of course, well, this could be a noble cause. Having a single army, yes, this could be a noble force, but there is more to it than, we should not take things at their face value. So I think this will further inflame the situation and firmly lead to a kind of polarization of the situation in Sudan from a military point of view and from a political point of view. Because the revolution in the first place was, took place against those particular persons, and they are accountable to the same people and with the international community. So it is a very negative development to my mind, and we will observe exactly what's going to happen here.
And it's very important to educate us and remind us how many factions of the SAF there are as well. I mean, we know the militia that got together for the RSF, but the SAF is not a unified voice either. And now we've got this other element. There's another question that's come in from the audience. And is it really to China's advantage that Sudan become a failed state and then they could try and help and rebuild it? EJ, could you think about that, and then anyone else chime in? Maybe Tom.
And no, frankly, I don't think it is in China's interest to see Sudan collapse. First of all, I mean, the most immediate is that China built a multi-billion-dollar pipeline to export oil from South Sudan through Port Sudan. And I think, greater instability risks that pipeline being destroyed and it costing the Chinese a lot of money. At the same time, I also believe that the Chinese recognize now that instability in Sudan itself would trigger instability in a lot of other countries where they have business interests. And I don't see that being in their interest. I think to some degree, it also applies to Russia. I know that people want to kind of fixate in Wagner. I think Wagner is a private military company that is being used by Moscow to kind of to be an irritant in Africa, to to make a lot of money from gold trade, but I don't see Russia being in a position to intervene in a very, very substantial way in Sudan. The biggest problem, as has already been mentioned, but I should repeat this, is Sudan is a country of 45 million people. At least half of those people live in cities. Those cities become untenable for most people if the civil war continues. And those people are going to flee. They are going to flee to other countries, particularly in the region. And so I think that it behooves the regional states to respond appropriately to end this conflict as soon as possible. And again, I believe that the worst case scenario is if regional states split in terms of who they support. And so I think the bigger effort would be trying to get the regional states to coordinate. And I do believe that the United States and other Western countries can play an important role in helping those countries coordinate. But I also agree with Ambassador Sati that it is the regional and continental institutions that should be playing the lead role in terms of trying to get the parties back to the negotiating table with an understanding that the ultimate goal is a restoration of a civilian transitional government, which is what the Sudanese people were demanding and which is going to be required for Sudan to get the money that it will need to rebuild the state and hopefully move forward.
Sure.
Ambassador Yates, I just want to pick up on the question you said about who's going to pay for this. So yes, we need to see a functioning government in Sudan to receive that. But what we want to also, what I hope is getting looked at is the work that has been done on Ukraine and on Afghanistan, where people look at money, central banks, and also the money of these warring actors, that they've amassed a lot of wealth. This is why they're in an existential fight for their existence, to hold on to that wealth. Look at that wealth and see, you know, if they were ordering the bombing of hospitals and key infrastructure, and then the other side of their efforts are they're amassing their wealth and storing it outside the country. I mean, how many times are we going to have this cycle where we have these massive catastrophes, the donor community comes together for a donor conference, when actually the wealth is sitting in the country with the parties who started the war? So I hope that there are people who've done this deep work on the Russian seizure of assets, or also looking at the central bank and the trust fund process in Afghanistan, are looking at the Sudan context right now and saying, let's actually see if the wealth that belongs to the Sudanese people can be used, that has been seized or taken or amassed by the warring parties, be used to rebuild this country.
Okay. Again, another great question in from the audience is, what is the African Union doing? Are they silent, or we just have not been made aware of what they are doing? Tim or Ambassador Sati, do either of you have thoughts on that?
Well, and let me jump in here, Barry. There was an effort to get the African Union, IGAD, and I believe South Sudan leaders in to actually halt the fighting early on. There was no way apparently to get into Khartoum at that point. The AU is seized with the matter in Diplo speak. But Nuruddin, perhaps you've got a little bit more on what's going on with the immediate neighbors there in the AU.
Well, not much more, but the AU has been convening a couple of meetings, even at the ministerial level, to discuss this, and I think they are coordinating with IGAD, with UN to see exactly how they can work together. And there's a proposal that the tripartite, which exists already, the AU, the UN, and IGAD, be extended to other countries and other organizations, including the Troika and some of the neighbors of Sudan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and probably Egypt also, if this is feasible, and see how collectively they can work together under the leadership of the African Union, and IGAD is there, of course, as you mentioned. IGAD meeting in Nairobi a few days ago, the second day actually after the conflict, convened and decided to say that presidents of Kenya, South Sudan, and Djibouti should go to Sudan, but logistically this has been difficult. But I understand that discussions are ongoing about how this can happen and what kind of support they will get from the African Union, the UN, and other partners.
Thank you. And it was great to have that question and be able to underscore that the African Union is doing things, but there were physical limitations of their representatives getting in. I think we could go on until noon or much longer, or I guess it's already past noon back there. I think what this underscores for the Atlantic Council is we need to have a longer conversation. We need to maybe have a series or a number of conversations as this situation continues. I want to thank all 5 of the panelists, of course, Director Rama Yasser and the Atlantic Council team, and all of you who participated. Thank you very much. And I think we're over the time limit now, but we will reach out and have another session, we hope, in the future. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.